Okay, the numbers have stabilised, so we'll start now. My name is Andrea Coomber. Welcome to, I'm the Chief Exec of the Howard League. Welcome to this Spotlight event looking at education and training in prisons in England and Wales. As you'll appreciate, education and training are a cornerstone of rehabilitation and of reducing reoffending. They keep people in prison occupied, provide opportunities to use time productively, to boost confidence, to give life skills, improve life chances and employability. And we know that lots of people going into prison have low educational attainment and sometimes some very damaging experiences of education as children. We also know that there are shockingly low levels of literacy and numeracy in prison, and yet we have a literally captive population of people who could be learners and people trained. Last month, new contracts were adopted, which have effectively dropped education availability by 20% across many prisons. In some prisons, it's been significantly more than that. This has affected courses from classroom lessons to trade skills. And while the Ministry of Justice insists that the spending it hasn't been cut, but they're just not getting the value they once did, and therefore it's an adjustment to inflation and additional costs. The reality is that it's meaningfully a cut. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Obviously, our prisons are increasingly volatile, little regime, increasing rates of drugs. There was a terrible report yesterday from HMIP of Liverpool Jail, which included 46% mandatory drug positives in the mandatory drug tests for people inside that jail, which I think, Charlie, is a record for a local jail, perhaps, but more violence and they're very difficult places increasingly. And so it's quite difficult to divorce, I think, any discussion of education and training from that context. But we're going to try to do that today. We'll be focusing on the adult estate. And maybe we'll take a look at children education on another occasion. So we have three fantastic expert panelists. They're each going to speak for about 5 minutes. Then we'll have a chat amongst ourselves and then open it up to the audience for questions. Please put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's where we will be going to see your questions. As ever, these things happen where people are slow to put questions in, then by the end, we're having to end the event with 30 questions that have gone unanswered. So get them in early and guarantee that the panel will respond to them. And then please use the chat box, as some of you already have done, to introduce yourselves and to say what brings you here, to respond to anything that the speakers are talking about. One of us, so our fabulous panel today is Kathy McGuinness, who is a Howard League member with experience of prison now in the community. John Collins, who's the Chief Exec of the Prison Education Trust, and Charlie Taylor, who is His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons and is the former head teacher and teacher himself. So we will be hearing brief presentations from each of our speakers. Kathy is actually on a train coming down for the Longford lecture. Speaking of education, Kathy and I actually know each other because we met through the Longford Trust. So Kathy's on a train, so we have pre-recorded her initial remarks, which we will start with now, but she'll be joining us for the Q&A later. So Clara, if we could go to Kathy's talk, that would be great.
Hello, my name's Kathy McGuinness, and I'm really pleased to be part of this Howard League Spotlight discussion. I approach this conversation not as a policymaker or academic, but as someone who has lived through the system and seen what prison education looks like, both its potential and its shortcomings. For me, education in prison was one of the few things that gave me hope. It offered me a sense of purpose, a reminder that I was still capable of rebuilding my life. But I also saw every day how broken the system can be and how many people it leaves behind. In theory, education should sit at the heart of rehabilitation. In practice, It's often about ticking boxes rather than unlocking potential. I've seen women who could barely read or write being handed colouring sheets simply because there wasn't enough qualified teachers or structured lessons. Too often, it was about getting bums on seats, not genuine learning or growth. And for those of us who came in with qualifications, it can be just as frustrating. I was required to take English and Maths level 2, despite already holding A-levels in both subjects. Later, when I was transferred to another prison, they tried to make me do level 2 English and Maths all over again. What makes that worse is that you're actually told you need these to be even considered for recategorisation. So again, it becomes a tick box exercise, a barrier to progress rather than a genuine opportunity to learn. There's little recognition of prior learning and no flexibility to meet people where they actually are. That experience showed me how depersonalised the system had become, more focused on targets than on transformation. I eventually became an education peer mentor, and honestly, that was one of the most rewarding things I did while I was in custody. Helping women fill out forms, prepare for courses, or find the confidence to try something new. For many, stepping into a classroom was absolutely terrifying. Some people have been told their whole lives that they weren't clever enough. Being a peer mentor showed me the real power of education when it's done properly. When people are treated as individuals, not statistics, you can see women start to believe in themselves again. And that belief can change everything, but it shouldn't rely on peer mentors to fill these gaps left by an underfunded and undervalued system. Every person deserves proper education, proper teaching and access to learning that meets their needs. When I wanted to study at a higher level, I discovered I couldn't apply for university distance learning through the normal prison channels. So I had to apply to the Prisoners Education Trust to fund an external course in business and management. That opportunity made a huge difference, but it came from a charity, not from within the system. Without PET, I wouldn't have been able to progress at all. And even later, when I was granted throttle to attend university, I had to fight to make it happen. There was no help with logistics or travel costs. Being told you chose education, you should have thought about how you were getting yourself there. I knew that the response went against policy, but it also revealed something deeper. In some prisons, there is a culture that almost discourages people from bettering themselves. It's almost as if wanting to learn and move forward is seen as stepping out of line. This is a mindset that needs to change. We can't keep talking about rehabilitation while making ambition something people are punished for. Education should be encouraged, supported and celebrated, not resisted. This is why the government's proposed cuts to prison education are so worrying. You can't talk about reducing reoffending while stripping away the very opportunities that help people change. HMIP reports repeatedly found that most education across the adult estate is poor or inconsistent, with staff shortages, cancelled classes, and almost no digital access. These problems are not new. They're just being ignored. To me, education didn't just change my life. It gave it back to me. It started in prison, and it's taken me all the way to university, where I've now completed my undergrads with first class honours, and I am now continuing with my masters, both in criminology. That is a journey that shouldn't be exceptional. it should be possible for anyone with the motivation to learn. But for every there are hundreds who never get that chance. If we truly believe in rehabilitation, then education must be at the heart of it, not the first thing on the list to be cut. Thank you.
It's fantastic, Kathy. Thank you very much. Kathy is, of course, here live as well as being a disembodied voice. We're going to move on. Kathy mentioned Prison Education Trust. John.
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Yes, as Andrea said, I'm Chief Executive of Prisons Education Trust. Thank you very much for the positive mention, Kathy, and I'm really glad we were able to help you along those steps on your educational journey. So yeah, we're a charity that provides access to distance learning in prisons across England and Wales, as well as taking a broader interest in prison education policy and practice. So just in my 5 minutes, first of all, and briefly, why does prison education matter? I don't think I really need to go into this in too much detail, given what we've just heard from Kathy about its central importance to rehabilitation. But we know, as Andrea mentioned, that people in prison are more likely to have had very disruptive experience of school and often quite negative experiences of school, are likely to have fewer qualifications than the general population on average, and to have lower levels of literacy and numeracy than the general population. And within that, I think it's really important to highlight that some people in prison have very low levels of literacy and struggle with very basic reading in terms of simple instructions, cards, certainly something like a letter from home. And that can make them very isolated in a prison regime that still often relies heavily on written instructions. So we know there's clearly an educational need there amongst the prison population, but it's also important to recognize that not everyone is struggling with literacy and numeracy. Some people want to change careers, to expand their horizons, think about what they want to do next. And the narrowness of prison education, which we're going to talk about in a minute, can be a real barrier to those people who want to progress, who want to go further, and who want to do more. Secondly, in terms of why education is important, there's extensive evidence from the UK and around the world now that participating in education reduces reoffending and increases the chance of someone getting a job on release. And so we know that those positive outcomes are pretty much undisputed in the evidence now. But as well as those outcomes, and every bit as important, I think, accessing education can also help with mental health and well-being and be a real source of hope and inspiration in a prison system that too often lacks those things for individuals, I think. And certainly the people who study our courses, our learners, consistently tell us how being able to do some sort of educational course, having those opportunities is transformational for them in terms of giving them hope, giving them a sense that they can turn their lives around when they leave. So given all those benefits, it's no surprise that prisons in England and Wales are required to provide education. In terms of how that's done, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds, but briefly speaking, in public sector prisons in England, most education is delivered by specialist providers under contract to the Ministry of Justice. And some of the challenges of those contracts and how they're designed have led to some of the sort of limitations and barriers that Kathy has mentioned. The country is split into geographical lots, and 3 education providers now split the lots between them. So every prison in a geographical area has education from a specific provider. Every provider has more than 1 lot now. In terms of what those providers deliver, they deliver basic literacy and numeracy classes up to level 2, vocational training, and some basic digital skills, though that provision is very limited in accessing a relatively small amount of people. As well as that, prisons have a relatively small budget to buy in other services based on what they need in their particular prison, through something called the dynamic purchasing system, though most people's experience is that it isn't that dynamic in practice. And that often leads to additional literacy support, sport, art and other creative provision, music, things that aren't otherwise available. On top of that, some training is provided by employers, and people can also access distance learning through us and others, particularly focused on further and higher education. And distance learning and further education is our particular focus as a charity. In terms of how it's delivered, models in Wales and the private sector are slightly different, but what's provided tends to be similar in focus. It's probably worth noting that in Wales, in most but not all prisons, education staff are employed directly by the prison service. So it's a different model from the kind of outsourced provision that we see in most prisons in England. So that's how it works. How's it working out in practice? I think it's always important to say that there are pockets of excellent practice, and there are teachers working flat out to deliver a good service in very difficult circumstances. And when you go around the prison system, you see these people who are doing their best, often in really challenging circumstances. But there are also a number of concerns. Firstly, fewer people are accessing education now than was the case a decade ago. So the numbers taking part are smaller, and given its clear benefits, that's bad news. Linked to that, prisons often have an issue with attendance at education. So I think the average attendance rate now is just over 2/3, about 70%, and a handful of prisons have attendance of less than 50%. So even the limited capacity we have available isn't being used to its full extent. But having said that, volume and attendance isn't everything. If you make attendance everything, you'll end up with people being put in classes that are right for them, as Kathy was describing, even just to make up the numbers and fill up the classrooms. So if the quality is good, that might not matter so much. But I think we can't really necessarily say that's the case. So Ofsted are responsible for inspecting prisons in England, Eston in Wales. And from the Ofsted inspections last year, just over half of prisons they inspected were judged to be inadequate, which is the lowest level, and a third were judged to be required improvement, the next one down. Just 5 prisons, so about 13% were good, and none were outstanding. There hasn't been a prison education department rated outstanding for 5 or 6 years now, which just wouldn't be acceptable in any other education sector, schools, further education, or elsewhere. There have been some improvements this year, a few more prisons rated good, a few less rated inadequate, which is good news. But if you look, just as an example, at the last 5 published inspections by Ofsted in England, 1 was requires improvement and 4 were inadequate. So you've still got a long way to go to see that quality improve. And I think there are challenges with how Ofsted inspections are done, but they, along with Charlie's work, are the independent measure of how well prisons are delivering education. And at the moment, they're clear. And I think anyone visiting a prison will see this, that by and large, the standard is not as good as it could be. And finally, into this already pretty bleak picture, as Andrea mentioned, a new set of contracts to deliver education in public sector prisons in England started on the 1st of October. And while the funding for them is incredibly opaque, and as Andrea mentioned, the Ministry of Justice is saying that the overall budget has not been cut, what's clear in practice is that it is. And from a prison point of view, and if you speak to prison leaders and visit prisons at the moment, they're facing substantial cuts, probably about 20% on average across the prison estate. But there are significant winners and losers within that. There's also been a redistribution of funding. So there are some prisons that are facing significantly bigger cuts than that. And on top of that, and while it's a relatively small pot, the funding that I mentioned that governors can use to buy in things that they need for their prison has also been cut from about 14% in 22 to about 12% this year, which proportionally, it's not very much money, but proportionally is a big chunk taken out of that budget and just gives governors less flexibility to buy in the things that they feel that they need. As well as these cuts are obviously going to have a huge impact on what can be delivered. And we're seeing teachers being made redundant, classes being cancelled, that offer being narrowed even further and less personalisation, which we know is what you actually need if you want to get the right education to the people at the time that they need it. But as well as there's impact on delivery, I think it's also having a huge impact on morale. I can understand that. I think it's hard to argue education is important and it's a priority while you're also slashing the budget for it and making teachers redundant and shutting down some classes that people in prison may have really valued and learners may have really found useful, but which if they're not covered by the contract, the providers just simply aren't able to put on anymore. So you're seeing that narrowing, which really hits people who've got particular needs or facing particular challenges or want to progress. So it's a slightly downbeat ending from me on the end of what's been a pretty downbeat presentation. But I do want to finish where I started by highlighting that prison education is incredibly important, and we all know that. But there are also pockets of really good practice in prisons around the country. And I think what we need now is to see that good practice replicated more widely. And crucially, I think the funding provided to enable that to happen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. Bleak indeed. To cheer us all up, we will now move on to Charlie Taylor. Go on, Charlie.
You reckon? Thanks very much. Really, two really interesting presentations. I originally was a head teacher of a special school for some years and worked in education for many years. So I came into this world with expectations of education being used as a great rehabilitative tool that I thought it could be. And I have to say, it's been a disappointing journey when it comes to the quality of prison education. Since the Inspectorate was founded in 1982, purposeful activity, one of our 4 tests, safety, respect, purposeful activity, and preparation for release. Purposeful activity has been consistently the lowest performing of our healthy prison assessments, going way back to the first ever annual report, in which the then Chief Inspector talked about blank inactivity. And it feels like a lot of prisoners are still stuck in blank inactivity in many of the prisons that we inspect, often finding prisoners locked in their cells for up to 22 hours a day, very often under the influence of the drugs, which are often widely available, particularly because of the ingress of drones, bringing contraband into prisons, and also just often a lack of really valuing of the power of education, the way in which it can transform people's lives. And Kathy has spoken very eloquently about what education did for her and what she saw it do for people around her. And we know it can have that transformative effect, but it feels that sometimes in prisons, staff, officers don't always realize the extent to which it can change people's lives. So when it comes to our reports, out of the last, out of the sort of post-COVID era, so I think 2022, when we went back to full inspection, we've inspected 96 closed prisons, and out of those 96, 88 of them scored poor or not sufficiently good for purposeful activities. So John talked about the last year or so, but actually this has been something that's been consistently bad since COVID. And what we still find in many establishments is that they still seem to be running a kind of COVID numbers going into education. So classrooms with only 3 or 4 prisoners in there, with only 3 or 4 prisons allocated, which is completely bizarre. I'd commend the report that we recently put out last month called Just Passing Time. And this was a thematic report where we tagged along on our normal inspections and looked at how prisoners are spending their time, what were the barriers to them getting involved in things like education, training, those sorts of things. And some of the findings of that report, I have to say, were fairly bleak as well. So the first thing was that there just simply aren't enough spaces in many jails for education, work and training. So you go to any of the Victorian Category B prisons, Leeds, Wormwood Scrubs, Pentonville, anywhere around the country, Bristol, Exeter, you find that there just simply aren't enough spaces. So prisoners who want to be able to get into education, work and training, they're just not able to do it because there isn't enough for them to do. And that really is because of the levels of overcrowding that we see in those prisons. And though the changes to early release schemes have taken the pressure off the system, don't be fooled into thinking that's solved overcrowding in any way, because it absolutely hasn't. And many places are still enormously overcrowded and therefore are simply unable to make provision in the way that they should for many of the prisoners there. The second thing that we found was that so many activities just are not really focused on giving prisoners the skills they need that are going to be useful on the outside. So, of course, it's good that prisoners are busy, but wouldn't it be so much better if prisoners were busy learning a skill, learning a trade, or involved in education in a way which was actually going to help them to get work or go into further education when they come out from the prison? But too often they're doing often quite mundane tasks that are not really making an enormous amount of difference. We found the school day is often very much curtailed. The working day is very short, but also the school day is often curtailed. Often there's no education at all taking place on a Friday. It's a 4-day week, which means, again, that the rate of learning that prisoners are able to get involved in just isn't as high as we would expect to see. And then finally, attendance rates are really appalling. So attendance is currently at about 67% of the 13 prisons that we looked at. Now, if I ran my school with a 67% attendance rate, I would be closed down in 5 minutes, and rightly so. So it is deeply depressing that in many prisons we're seeing very few prisoners getting to education, or nothing like the rate. And look, we have a bit of sympathy where it's a really busy reception prison where prisoners may be getting to court, they may be have meetings with their lawyers, they may have healthcare meetings, but we're also talking about category C prisons where prisoners are spending long periods of time, and those kind of levels of attendance are really bad. There are a few places where they're much better, in the high 80s, early 90s, and that's really the minimum of where we'd want to see attendance at education, because if people are going to really make progress, they need to be there every day, and the prison needs to enable them to be there. What we find, sadly, is that if there aren't staff available, then the easy option is simply taken to close education for the day if there aren't enough staff available to escort, or if teaching staff don't come in. I was really depressed to go into an education facility in one jail where I found the classrooms were all empty and there were 3 managers sitting in a room chatting together. And I said, "Why are there no classes?" And they said, "The teachers are ill." And I was horrified, because had in my school one of the teachers been ill and we had no cover, obviously I, as the head teacher, or my deputy, would have gone in and taught the lesson. And you would find that in any class in the country. And yet in prisons, it was just simply easier to send the prisoners back onto the wing. So that's a huge issue, that real motivation to get people to education. We're seeing these cuts to education that both John and Kathy have talked about. I think the highest rate of reduction in service has been 64% in HMP North Sea Camp, but 50% reduction in the service is not at all unusual. So on the one hand, we're talking about rehabilitation. On the other hand, depressingly, we're just seeing that rate of cut, that the offer is just much reduced. And sadly, some very good people have been made redundant as a result of it. I do just want to finish on a slightly more optimistic note, and there's a hugely long way to go here. But in 2022, our colleagues in Ofsted and HMIP did a thematic report looking at the teaching of reading in prisons. And I was horrified to see that, despite the fact that so many prisoners had literacy issues, that actually reading was not prioritised. And the Shannon Trust, which is a good, worthy organisation that does good things, was really the only thing that was on offer for prisoners. So if you could read okay, you could get onto a functional skills course. If you couldn't, you were sent over to the Shannon Trust, but that was purely dependent on prisoners being unlocked to actually do the mentoring, that the allocations were done properly, that there was a space available for that work to be able to be done. So we put out a report in 2022, and we did a follow-up report a year later, and it was a pretty bleak picture. Prisoners weren't being assessed on their reading skills. Prisons had no reading strategy. Prison libraries were often underused, particularly after COVID. We've revisited this teaching reading in prison, and we were particularly looking for some jails where there was better practice, and we were delighted to find some prisons where actually things are much better. So you go to a jail like Hatfield, and they're absolutely committed. Reading is part of everything that jail does. So if you're a non or poor reader, you'll get support there. But everybody else is supported within the jail. There's an expectation that everybody will read and everyone will talk about reading. Ramby, which is a Cat C prison with lots of challenges, particularly around drugs, a real focus on officers identifying prisoners who were struggling to read, not looking beyond the behaviour and understanding that actually one of the reasons they may be playing up is actually because they have been asked to read something and they're being defensive. So identifying readers and putting in proper support in place. At Chelmsford as well, the prison that obviously has had a difficult couple of weeks, but again, they're in a very busy reception prison. The governor has really pushed hard, and a brilliant head of education, learning and skills has really pushed hard at improving and getting a focus on reading, and actually convincing prison officers that actually allowing and focusing on reading is a way of reducing levels of violence and disorder within the prison, because prisoners feel like they're making progress with their sentence. They're less bored during the day, and therefore less tempted to get involved in nefarious sorts of activity. So some really encouraging prisons that we visited. Similarly, Rye Hill, where they have a drop everything and read session every week. So everybody in the prison, including the governor downwards, sit down and they just read a book for a bit. And reading again is absolutely part of that jail. It has a really strong reading strategy. Sadly, there are still jails where the reading strategy is simply gathering dust on a shelf somewhere, where prisoners aren't assessed properly, where support for reading isn't as good as it should be. But I do want to highlight the places who've really taken this on and are doing some really wonderful stuff when it comes to reading. So the potential is out there, as ever with prisons. There's loads of brilliant people who have taken this on and gripped it. Frankland is another case in point where, again, an outstanding offer for reading. So it's not all bad. There is some good activity going out there, but it needs real commitment from the leadership within the prison service and from individual governors if we're going to really make a progress, the progress that we should be in this area. Thank you very much.
It's one of those lottery things, isn't it? Like you're just
it is.
lucky,
It is. If
you're
you
lucky to be in a jail where there's good literacy and support, or you can be somewhere where you don't even have access to a Shannon Trust.
And so often that's dependent on one or two brilliant people in that jail. So it's really kind of in spite of the system rather than because of it, and that's really unfair.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you to all of our speakers. We'll have a quick discussion amongst ourselves before we go to the questions. John, you mentioned that there are fewer people in education now. Do we know why that is?
I think there's two separate things going on. One is there's a sort of longer term downward trend that partly obviously then got a steeper drop off during COVID, and it has been recovering since, but it still hasn't recovered to pre-COVID levels. I think there's a number of reasons of that around the way the contracts are arranged, long-term decline in funding, and changes in prison regimes and that sort of thing. I think more recently, I think funding has got tighter, meaning that prisons are able to provide less. But I know you want this session to focus on education rather than on the broader crisis in the prison system. But when you look at regimes as a whole, the amount of time people are spending in their cells, and the difficulty getting people out of their cells and into education departments or elsewhere, prison education is largely still quite traditional. So it's getting people into classrooms in front of a teacher, and lots of prisons just are really struggling to do that. And Charlie and I both mentioned attendance. If you've got a limited amount of capacity and you're only using 2/3 of it, because you, by and large, you can't get people to the education class at the right time to do a particular class or course on a consistent basis, you're going to see fewer and fewer people participating. And I also think it's worth recognizing that not everyone in prison sees the value of education. They've had a negative experience at school, then another negative experience while they're in prison. Of course, it's not being very good quality or not running consistently. You need to sell education to people and make sure they recognize the value of it. There are lots of people in prison who want to do education. That's great. There are others who are less convinced. You need to sell it to them. You need to make it possible, and things like pay are an issue there. And then once you've done that, you really need to make sure the regime's set up to enable people to access it consistently. For a lot of people, that's getting them out of their cell during the day. But there are some prisons, for example, that do a really good job of putting on some sessions in the evening for people who are out on Rossall, in the open estate, out on Rossall during the day, who can then, if they want to do distance learning or learning that complements what they're doing during the day, they have sessions in the evening to support them to do that. So I think an inflexible education offer and poor regimes often mean that you don't get as many people in the classroom as you'd like to.
Yeah. Kathy, I wonder if you have any reflections on what you've heard from John and Charlie.
Just going back to what John's just been talking about now about getting people into classrooms, there is a lot of lack of motivation with a lot of people in prison. Some of them would rather go to their work party they've been allocated to because they're getting paid a higher wage for it, whereas if they go to the education block, they're getting a very small amount of money. So I think if there could be some type of incentive up there, like a lot more people would be more happier to attend. Yeah, nothing has ever gone back to the way it was before COVID. Absolutely nothing. I was there during COVID. And education just stopped. It just ceased completely. So when you have that for 2 years and then expect people to jump back into a classroom, they're not going to do it. They're going to come up with every excuse to just lay about all day because that's what they got used to. And again, it's about finding that inner motivation within them, and we can do it. As a peer mentor, I did help several people. One woman started, I don't even understand how she got onto it. She did start long distance learning for criminology, and she couldn't do it. I helped her with the first essay. I thought, because she was giving up. And I helped her with the first essay, and she got 80 something %, and she was absolutely delighted. But that made her carry on. So it is about finding their motivation. Staff, the education staff now, Charlie's right, John's right, they're not all bad. There are some like really good people who want to do right and give people an education. But again, because of the regime, it's not always possible. It doesn't open on Friday, it doesn't run a full day through the week, and there's breaks in between. And so a learning day, I think out of 6 hours, you might get 3.5. So it's not really enough time for people
what you get in the community
to get focused.
And where do you think, Charlie, John, where do you think responsibility for this lies? When I talk to prison governors about prison education, they'll invariably blame the providers or the contract or the staff, or like, I mean, who's responsible?
Well, shall I go first, John?
Yeah,
Sorry,
go.
I can't see you at the moment. But I mean, I think there's a sort of shared responsibility here, because it's very easy to blame the provider, but actually what we also find is you go and talk to people who are actually teaching in prisons. You know, it's a difficult job at times, and the enormous frustration they have. I remember going to a maths class in a prison, and there were 3 prisoners in there. I said to the teacher, "How many are allocated?" She said 10. I said, "Do 10 ever turn up?" She said, "Never." She said, "I never know who's going to turn up in any one day. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 8, and sometimes it's no one at all. And it's never the same people either." So, you know, in a subject which has linear progression like maths, it makes life extremely difficult for her to do. So the danger is actually you get someone who's bright, enthusiastic, and shiny-eyed about wanting to make a difference. But actually, if no one ever turns up, they begin to get fed up and demoralized, and then will leave. And I think that's certainly an issue with trying to recruit really high-quality people often. So I think it's a shared responsibility. I mean, I'm very uneasy about the idea of big centrally let contracts. I think they're very clunking. I think the idea that you turning the dials from Whitehall really is the best way to make sure that, or for Whitehall to really understand what, you know, prisoners in HMP Durham need to be really learning about. So I'm uneasy about that. There was at one stage a push to get prisons to take there was going to be a trial for prisons to take responsibility for their own education in a very limited amount of cases. It was something I was agitating for a lot, and therefore you'd put responsibility and accountability in the same place. But sadly, that minister left, and it was quietly swept away by officials and never saw the light of day again.
Any thoughts, John?
Yeah, thanks. I agree with what Charlie just said. I mean, I think it's important to us. It is difficult. It is a difficult environment to provide good quality education is, and it's always important to recognize that. But some prisons do it better than others. And I think my experience of where prisons are doing it well, it's a really strong partnership between the prison and the provider working collaboratively, with the governor really championing prison education. And where it's not working well is where you get the provider blaming the governor blaming the prison, you know, and that sort of, so
exactly.
I think good practice is where you have good cohesive delivery, and you've got the newish now heads of education, skills and work role, whose job it is to bring that together. And again, where I think that role is working well, they're providing that cohesive offer and not doing a them and us prisons and provider split. And they normally need the governor's backing to do that. So I think that shared responsibility is really important. But I think you can't get away from the fact that funding's not the only issue, but it is a very significant issue. and government have chosen to reduce that funding to a certain degree, and that is making it more difficult to provide a good quality, broad offer that deals with what is often a cohort with some varied and quite challenging needs. So I think you get good practice where it's joint working, but government needs to take responsibility for funding it and for the contracts that it's let through at the moment to provide the right environment, to provide a good service. And sometimes when you talk to prisons that are doing well, they will tell you that essentially they're doing it in spite of the contract rather than because of it. And that suggests to me that at least the last set of contracts weren't quite getting the balance right in terms of sort of central control versus local variation. We'll see how the new contracts play out. But even funding aside, they don't feel radically different from what was there before.
I mean, we know that a couple of you have touched on this. We know that lots of people in prison have learning difficulties and challenges with neurodiversity. To what extent is that considered an issue? Like, is there adjustment for that? Kathy's just shaking her head. We don't need to talk about it. It's just, I mean, it's like, is there any recognition of that? Is there any adjustment to contracts for that? Are there places that are providing, suitable special educational needs support? Charlie, I guess I'm looking to you. Like, you used to run a school like that. You must be frustrated.
Yeah, I am, and there are some examples we come across where they've really thought about prisoners with learning difficulties or with neurodiverse needs more widely. And there are neurodiversity support officers in prisons, which was introduced off the back of the thematic report that we did for Robert Buckland whenever, what was it, 3 years ago, 4 years ago even. There's been no real assessment of the impact of the quality of those people. So we see them doing, what appear to be good stuff, but in terms of assessing the impact, that's probably a bit of work that needs to be done by the prison service. But we know the level of need is there, and the gap often between the level of need and the ability of the prison to really get to grips with the challenges that some of those prisoners face, particularly when they're in the context of prison, and the effect that could also have on and the difficulties it can bring for people with those sorts of difficulties. It's a pretty patchy outlook there, but generally things are fairly poor. If you've got learning difficulties, your outcomes are going to be so much worse in many ways. And in our thematic report that's coming out next year about reading, one of the things we've done is compared outcomes for prisoners who can read well versus those who can't. And you won't be surprised to know that by almost every metric, prisoners who can read reasonably well do far better than those who don't. So in terms of violence, segregation, living conditions, by almost every metric, those who have been supported with their reading do better than those who haven't.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I think the introduction of neurodiversity support managers by the last government was a good thing. As Charlie says, we haven't really evaluated the impact of that. Again, I think they're doing well where they have the support of the prison management and are taking a whole prison approach to doing this, and it's more of a challenge than just a person rushing around trying to help individuals. But there are some prisons who do this well, or relatively well. For example, I think the neurodiversity team at Usk and Prescoed in Wales is a good example of a team that's taking a whole prison approach to trying to support neurodiverse people, and that includes the education department, but their broader experience in the prison. And I think situating education support within the supports available across the prison so it's consistent is really valuable. And there's some good initiatives. So Wakefield a while ago, and they've got a kind of inclusion room as part of their education provision. Again, I don't think it's been formally evaluated, but the people who've used it were very positive about the impact that it's had. So there are pockets of really good practice on this, I think. And this is a theme that I come back to a lot, but it's always surprising when you visit a lot of prisons that some prisons are really doing really good stuff, and very few people in other prisons seem to know much about it.
Yeah.
And that sort of sharing of good practice, because I mean, Wales, the setup in Wales is slightly different, but even within England, best practice often isn't shared particularly consistently. So where prisons are doing things well, it's not always picked up. But I think, yeah, there are a few prisons that have really tried to make some difference on this, and it will be useful, I think, over time to both collate those examples and evaluate their impact, so you can get a sense of what good support looks like. And the same for people with learning difficulties and disabilities. As Charlie said, it's a big cohort of the population. Some of them need relatively light touch support, some people significantly more, and enabling prisons to both evaluate that effectively, so to know what people need, to transfer that information around the estate so people aren't being assessed over and over and over again, which still happens even though it shouldn't, and then to act on it is really important. And to come back to one of the other themes of today, all these things are more difficult with less resource. So if you've got people with higher levels of need, you might need one-to-one support or particular provision. It's just harder to do that if you've got less money.
Yeah, I mean, when I've had conversations in the past about neurodiversity, something we're concerned about and talk about a lot with prison governors, it'll always be generally about behaviour and behaviour management. And when you start raising education, it's sort of like not about education. You know, like these are people who are just trying to control them and get them to be relaxed into this environment more than actually step them on that journey towards training and work. Kathy, you talked about that kind of tension between training and education, like you can go off to work or you can do your education. Do you think there are better ways that prisons could incentivize people to do education?
Well, I think one of the things is like not use it as a stick to, you know, whack you with, like you do this or you don't get that. If you focus it on, if you do this, this is what is going to happen at the end of it, but like make it more of a positive journey. Not, oh, well, you can't do that job because you haven't got level 2 English or you haven't got level 2 maths, so you can't go and do a plastering course or a bricklaying course, because you don't need level 2 or English or maths for all that. You just go and you learn the job. Yeah. You know, you don't need to be a rocket scientist, but I think it needs to be thought out more on that basis of, do people really need that to do that? As long as people can read and write, because a lot of people don't even have them basics. You know, they can't sign the name on the form. As long as we can get people to do that, they.
Oh, I think we're losing you, Kathy.
They can go on.
Okay, I think we've lost Kathy in a tunnel. So we'll
as long as
turn
we
to
can
some
get people to do that, can.
Okay, Kathy, I think we've lost you. So we'll turn to some of the questions in the Q&A box already. There are a lot of them. Oh gosh, where to start? Let's start. There's a couple of these people don't give very long questions. They're too difficult to get ahead of. Why is the government failing with rehabilitation of prisoners? I think we've already kind of touched on that a little bit. I mean, I guess there's a question here from Liz. I think my summation of what is quite a long, detailed question is that, I mean, it's a terrible kind of scenario of people being let down in prison through education. And really, her question is, you know, when you raise concerns about education, does the government care? You know, like when we talk about education failing people, I guess, Charlie, you're the best person to answer this. You know, does government listen? Does education matter in the context, do you think, of prisons? For Minister.
Well, I think I mean, my feeling is that it doesn't matter as much as it should. You know, if we score prisons when we inspect them, a 1 is poor, a 2 is not sufficiently good, a 3 is reasonably good, and a 4 is good. If we score a prison a 1 for safety, that gets people twitchy in the Ministry of Justice. It gets people in the prison service worried. But if we score a prison for purposeful activity as a 1, I think there's just a bit of a collective shrug, you know, well, what do we expect, really? So I think expectations are just incredibly low. I think it's, you know, high fives all round if people manage to get a 2 for for purposeful activity. So I think really the prison service needs to really reorientate towards thinking about education, training, skills, work. It really needs to be thinking about the journey that people are on and what people are going to do whilst they're in prison. Some of whom are serving a long sentence, but also what they're going to do when they come out and how you're going to prepare them for that. And I think it's it just doesn't get anything like the priority that it needs. And I think it needs a revolution to really get education on the map in the way that it should be. So it's absolutely part of the offer. But we have seen with this really thematic that some jails where there is the commitment, it can be done. So you know, I'm always optimistic when I go and see as good practice as that it is doable.
John, related to that, is DFE a better place for us to, like, do we have a more sympathetic hearing in Department for Education? Does that matter?
I'm not sure it matters that much personally. I mean, people will probably know that DFE used to be responsible for prison education, and 2019 it was moved across to the Ministry of Justice following a review of prison education by Dame Sally Coates, to give prison overall responsibility for education alongside the other bits of prison that it's responsible for. I don't think that's created the improvements that anyone hoped it would do. I don't think there's any particular interest or aspiration from the Department for Education to take it back. I do think there is a broader issue that I think been mentioned in a couple of the comments or questions about how you link up education in the community with education in prison for prison leavers, but also for people who are still in prison. There are some examples of good partnership working between prisons and local FE colleges that tries to broaden what's on offer using sometimes release on temporary license. And I think to try and build on that and to try and enable prisons to take advantage of mainstream prison education funding, what we probably do need is better links between prison education and the Ministry of Justice, Department for Education, and increasingly, I think, Department for Work and Pensions, who are taking on more responsibility for adult skills, to ensure that what's available in prison aligns with what's needed in the community, which is a huge challenge. But then people who are studying in prison, whether it's FE or people who want to do HE study, as Kathy mentioned, all the barriers to that at the moment, to smooth that transition between the prison walls for people leaving, but also to enable community provision to be brought into prisons where that's appropriate and where funding is available. So partnerships between government departments are really difficult, but I do think whichever way you do it, in order to make prison education work properly, you do need the Ministry of Justice, Department for Education and DWP to think about how they can work better together. And I'm not sure that's really happening at the moment. I think DFE, we're glad to see the back of prison education. It's a very difficult area to deliver well in, and I'm not particularly interested in getting it back. But I do think, final point, I do think that we've just signed another set of contracts. It's going to be a long time before we're looking at this again. But I do think if we're going to maintain this model of sort of outsourced education provision, I think the Ministry of Justice and DFE do need to look more closely at what a good education contract looks like, because the way that prison education is funded via contracts is nothing like school or FE funding and how that's managed and controlled. And I think there are lessons to learn from how you fund education in the community and then trust professionals to get on with delivering it versus what's quite a centralized and management heavy offer from the Ministry of Justice, who are maybe less used to contracting education provision. So I think one way or another, you've got to improve that relationship between departments and what's being delivered locally.
A question here from Jenny. Can you please say something, perhaps Kathy, if you've got any observations on this, can you please say something about education for prisoners for whom English is not their first language?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's really, it's poor having a lot of people go in there that they don't understand it. Again, I was peer mentor and helped people as much as I could, but I'm not a teacher. Yeah, a lot of them do go on to get, I think it's level 1, entry level 1, and they don't really get much higher than that. I think it's considered as long as they have the basics and they can communicate eventually. It's just not really top list.
Charlie, do you know if there are like prisons like
just-
Wandsworth that have big numbers of foreign nationals? Do they have, maybe somebody in our audience knows, because we have people from Wandsworth in the audience. You know, do prisons like that have lots of foreign nationals have special educational support for English as a second language?
I can't remember what the provision's like at Wandsworth. I'm sorry on that front, but I mean, interestingly, so yeah, some prisons. I don't know what has happened as a result of the cuts, though. Actually, so whether one of the courses that they've decided to cut has been English as an additional language, so I'm not sure about that. But you know, we do see there are a lot of very enthusiastic foreign nationals who are desperate to learn English and really keen to do that. And we do see actually that sometimes English and functional skills classes are actually full of those prisoners who aren't necessarily the right prisoners to have in those classes. They ought to be focusing more on English skills, sort of more broadly, rather than the sort of rather basic functional skills. But often they're some of the most enthusiastic learners that we see in prisons.
John, there's also a question here from Wally McDonald about different approaches, standards in private versus public prisons. Is there any general observations?
I think it's difficult to say for sure. I mean, obviously, private prisons sit outside the delivery contracts that we've been talking about, and then therefore have different models. Though increasingly, they're moving towards a kind of a similar model where you have an outsourced specialist provider, but it's obviously done at a prison level rather than sort of by national contracts. I think there are some really excellent private prisons. We've always had very positive experiences of working with Park. I know that Park's been a prison that's had some difficult times in recent years, but from an education point of view, I know we're talking about adults today, but with young people and with adults and with their distance learning provision, I think there's been, you know, we've always worked with them well and found them very receptive to working with us on provision of distance learning. There are other excellent private sector prisons. Oakwood normally gets mentioned, which, as with all things, its education provision is better than average, I would say. But I wouldn't say necessarily that there is consistently a picture one way or the other on public or private prisons. I think that sometimes private prisons have more flexibility to go their own way. But in my experience of visiting them, a lot of them, the provision is similar in focus to what's available in public sector prisons, recognizing that the cohort of people they're working with have similar backgrounds and similar needs. And lastly, obviously, all prisons in the adult state don't have control over who's sent to them and have relatively limited control over the sort of the physical environment they're working in. So there are particular challenges that individual prisons face that aren't really related to whether they're public or private sector. It's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but I think the honest answer is I don't really know. But there are some really examples of good practice in both sectors.
Yeah, Caroline's asked a question about the provision of education in the women's versus the men's estate. Connects to a part of a question that's earlier in the list from Jonathan, asking, like, basically saying that people on remand don't get education. One thing I've noticed that is in the women's estate, women on remand do seem to get education in a way they don't necessarily in the male estate, or aren't pushed into it in the same way. I'm not sure if anybody's got observations. Charlie, you look at both of these, John.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange thing that there's often a lazy assumption made that those on remand don't want to be in education, and that's palpably not true. And loads of prisoners do want to be in educational work, or you know, they don't just want to be locked in their cells. So, but it's a kind of easy, it's an easy assumption, and it means you can just keep people locked away, which is unfortunate. I think the women's estate is again a bit of a mixed picture, actually. So, you know, lots of women we talk to, you know, levels of self-harm are 8 times higher than within the male estate. And one of the causes of that amongst the women that we talk to are often because they're just locked up with not enough to do for long periods of time, and things are pretty bleak. So, you know, you go to somewhere like Send, which is a really impressive jail, and they do get them out of their cells, and the education provision there was pretty strong. But we also go to other jails where things are not good.
Kathy?
Yeah, I think it depends on what prison you're in. Again, it always goes back to the postcode lottery. But remand, when you're on remand, you don't have to work and you don't have to go to education. You can choose, because you're just there being held. You don't have to follow the regime like everybody else does. And that's just the way it is. But you know, a lot of people do choose to go to education rather than, like Charlie just said, rather than sit in the cell. But going back to what we said earlier on, again, that depends on staff levels, whether the staff do get you over there or not.
Yeah, I wonder if it's also a bit about culture, because I know, like Peterborough, Bronzefield, women on remand tend to go to education. I don't know, John, have you, maybe this is the reason percentage-wise that more people are not going to education, because there are just percentagely, word I've made up, more people on remand within the estate.
I mean, I think, yeah, clearly there is many more people on remand, and the big change, I think, is that obviously people on remand in general for much, much longer than they used to be. So at one point it was seen that there wasn't really any point in starting education because there wouldn't be enough time for them to complete anything valuable. I do question that to a degree, and that I think there is some stuff you can do even in relatively short periods of time.
I agree.
If you're resourced to do it, particularly around reading and literacy. There's stuff you can, but even so, people are now spending 2 more years on remand. You can't not offer them anything. I take the point that not everyone wants to, and you can't make people, but I think increasingly there will be pressure to offer more. And on the women's estate, yeah, as I said, it's a mixed bag. But our experience in terms of offering distance learning is that I think about just over 10% of our applications and our learners come from women, which obviously is twice what you'd expect, more than twice what you'd expect based on the makeup of the prison population. Even more than that when you consider a lot of women are on short sentences. So there is clearly that demand there to access learning, and maybe to access learning that isn't available to them in their prison, which makes distance learning look more appealing. So I think there probably is some work to do to think about what a good offer in a women's prison looks like, how that differs from a men's prison, and how you can design the kind of right offer that takes into account what women are looking for. And one change with the current set of contracts is that the women's estate used to be part of the women's estate used to be a specialist lot in its own, that people were just working with women. Now it's been put into the sort of broader geographical lots, and we'll have to see if that has any difference in terms of what's specifically offered to women and whether that has any impact on the quality of what's available.
There's a good question here, perhaps keeping on with you, John, from AXA, saying, have there been attempts to construct a more tailored approach that would serve to make sessions more attractive for prisoners, particularly from a teacher training lens? I mean, this is something you often hear when you talk to people in prison, that what's on offer is not that interesting, or actually, I mean, I was in one prison earlier in the year talking to the head of education, who was concerned that, well, he was having to employ teachers on 50% of what he would employ them for on the outside, which was making it very difficult. But also that they had courses available at their jail, like hairdressing courses, when a lot of the men at that prison aren't allowed to have scissors or sharp objects. You know, like it just wasn't, in his view, like wasn't particularly well tailored to the needs of the people in the prison. Like, to what extent are people consulted about what would be interesting to them? Has there been kind of innovation around kind of content of courses to make them attractive?
Yes, this is a constant concern that what's available is very one size fits all. It's quite narrow in terms of what people are able to provide, and delivering education by central contract mandates that to a degree, because providers are expected to deliver certain classes at certain volumes. That said, there are prisons that are innovating using dynamic purchasing system funding or other sources of funding, creating partnerships, for example, with employers or local FE colleges. I mentioned, I think Stamford Hill does a partnership with East Kent Colleges Group, where people go out on Rottle to get access to training they might not be able to have access to in prison because of what's available within the prison gates, though the training college itself is just outside the prison, so it's easy to get to and from. So there are examples of people doing different things. I mentioned Prescoid earlier, putting on evening classes for people who are out during the day, to enable people to continue to study and work at the same time in an open prison. So there are pockets of, I think, of really good innovation. And there are prisons that we work with in terms of providing distance learning, who are going above and beyond in creating communities of distance learning, so it's not so lonely, giving them opportunities to come together. So as I've sort of said throughout, there are people who try and tailor the offer to who they've got, who try and think how they can lever in extra provision to meet needs that they're not able to meet through their central contracts. And some of the education providers, at least under the last contracts, stretch that funding as far as they can to put in other things that they're not mandated to do, but which they can see that prisons require. And I think one of the things that Ofsted often point out is where that is or isn't happening. So where they're managing to tailor the offer to the population. But it's a real mixed bag. And there are other prisons where people will tell you there's just not anything they're very interested in doing or that meets what they want to do when they're released. And in that circumstance, you can see why education is less appealing, because you want to do things that interest you and you think are going to help you when you're released. And sometimes that's maths and English, but sometimes it isn't. And having that broader offer is really important.
I guess the flip side of that, Charlie, is how do you make it more attractive for teachers? I'm just going to give my dog a bone while it's to stop him barking. But like, how can you attract, if it's not just money, how can you attract more teachers to this other side?
Well, I think, I mean, I alluded to before the idea of just getting prisoners to actually turn up so they know who's going to be there. And I think that really matters. You know, what you find is often people have gone into prison education because they want to escape from some of the kind of treadmill of education in schools. So it isn't always about the pay for those people. They want a job that gives them more fulfillment and satisfaction. And I think the problem is if prisoners don't show up and they don't know who they're gonna get every day, I think that is a hugely demoralizing thing for them. I also think making sure that the curriculum is right, so making sure it's really well connected with what the prisoners need, and making sure that gap is filled, because otherwise, what you find is people teaching lessons that that are just completely not appropriate, either because, as Kathy said, they're asked to do courses that are far too easy for them, or vice versa, where they're put in a room where they can't cope. And often what you end up with is the most depressing lowest common denominator, which is when you walk into a room and find prisoners colouring in a poster. And quite honestly, I'm not sure what the learning intention is when you see that happening, particularly in the youth estate, but I see it far more often than I would like to.
I mean, I do get this sense sometimes. I was in one jail last year where there's a tea bag workshop where they just put together tea packs in the morning. And I went up and it was for people on the VP unit. And, you know, it's obviously not a skill. Like nobody's getting skilled up by putting tea bags into a bag. But it was providing the men with something like a social activity to come together to get out of their cell.
Yeah.
And later in the conversation, the governor talked about how she was going to get rid of that because it wasn't purposeful work. And I think I do find myself struggling with this kind of tension between ensuring things are meaningful, but if the alternative to something meaningful is nothing, then give me
I agree.
workshop.
I mean, where we see it work best, actually. I mean, there are some prisoners, you know, they, for example, with, you know, quite severe learning difficulties, for example, and that might be the right thing for them to be doing, actually, that they're probably not going to be able to get into more sophisticated types of employment, and therefore it probably works reasonably well for them. But I think where we see that work best is where you go into a kind of entry level workshop in a prison. I mean, someone like Rye Hill does this really well, where you go into an entry level and the work is relatively mundane, but actually if you work hard and prove you can do it, then you can work your way up the kind of hierarchy of jobs within the prison and get into some jobs that not only are more fulfilling and interesting, but also pay more as well. And you know, there are prisons in that jail earning kind of 70 quid a week, which you know, for anybody who knows about prison education or work, you know, we're normally talking about 10 or 11 quid a week, so you know, it's pretty substantial. So I think where there's a sense of progression, then I think, you know, we're not anti those kind of workshops, but some of them are so mundane that really one wonders. I mean, there's another ones where they're unpicking CDs from boxes, and again, that's just not particularly, and there's one where they pull cotton off a bobbin, or wool, is it? Which again, it feels pretty meaningless, and you know, it's fine if there's nothing else on offer, but you know, we want something a bit more meaningful.
I mean, I've also seen some amazing, like there's a fantastic workshop at Moorland. So Moorland has two sides, or did when I was there. One which is just people convicted of sexual offences, and this is a workshop for people convicted of sexual offences. And it teaches them Braille and teaches them how to become Braille.
Oh yes, I've seen that. Yeah, it's great.
Which is so great. Like it's a highly specialised skill. that people who might not easily be able to get mainstream employment when they come out can set themselves up as consultancies, can do it from home, can avoid kind of stigma in the workforce. Like it's like really kind of innovative and meaningful, people like giving people an ability to be truly expert in something that the rest of us have got no hope at all to understand. So yeah, I think there is a huge variety out there, but it comes back to that, well, what is the purpose of education training? One of the questions we've been asked is, should budgets just be focused on those people who are able to attain? And I think we'd probably all kind of object to an idea that education really does need to be for everybody. I'm afraid we've lost Kathy because her train has arrived in London. She's been kicked off. So our huge thanks to Kathy, who's been logged off. Our huge thanks to Kathy for joining us today. Rona sort of suggested that she'd heard something incorrectly when she said 2 or 4 years on remand. Did I hear that right? Yes, Rona, 4 years. We've got members who've been approaching 5 years on remand, but 2 years is certainly not exceptional. We've got kids who we're in touch with who are 2 years on remand in YOIs. So that, that is the extent of the Crown Court backlog. And the reality for lots of these people. I think worth remembering that more than 50% of people, it's up to 75% for children and women, but about 50% of men who go to court will be acquitted or sentenced to less time than they've served and are just released. And that brings all kinds of challenges of its own. So my thanks to our panel. One final comment was Belle's asked a question about the place for volunteer reading supporters. I mean, the Shannon Trust trains people to teach other prisoners to read. It's one of those training of trainers sort of models. I'm not sure if they have roles for volunteers, but they may well, John. Do you know?
They certainly have roles for volunteers. I don't know to the extent that that they still work within prisons directly to provide reading, but there definitely are volunteering opportunities at Shannon Trust and at other charities working in this field. We've obviously mentioned the Longford Trust, who have mentors for people who are doing sort of higher education, so that's at the sort of opposite end of the scale. And there are a number of charities that do book clubs in prisons, or that sort of thing. So lots of opportunities for sort of small charities that do this work around reading or education more broadly, for volunteers and for support more generally. And I think, very briefly, my experience of this is that pretty much every charity providing education in this field, big or small, has more demand for what they have to offer than they can possibly meet. So whether it's support in terms of volunteering time or donations or that sort of thing, charities are filling these gaps in what the state makes available. And the more resource they have, the more gaps that they can fill. So I think if people are keen to help, it is finding charities in your local area or charities that provide education and thinking about how you can help them, because the gaps are getting bigger and charities are having to work harder to fill those gaps.
Yeah, and Margaret's asked a question about, should we write to our MPs? Should we get in touch with MPs, ask them to raise this? Yes, Margaret. I mean, people should be marching upon Downing Street about the cuts to education contracts, in my view. Like, it is an absolute disgrace. So I think we do need to, if as is obviously clear, if education training have a role in rehabilitation and restoration to citizenship of people in our prisons, to cut the ability of people to access those courses and to be able to achieve the benefits of education and training, really is so counterintuitive to everything the government says it wants to do to reduce reoffending. That's and it's a dire state. It's sort of shameful upon our system that this is the thing that's kind of first meaningfully been cut. So my huge thanks to Charlie and to John and to Kathy for their time. I hope you will all clap them at home. This is unfortunately the awkward thing of Zoom. We will try to have another Spotlights event before the end of the year. But if not, we will see you in the new year for it. My thanks to Charlie and John. Thank you all. Have a very nice day.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks very much, Andrea. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, everyone.